You've landed on The Substance, a podcast aimed at being biblical, thoughtful, and human. Join us here every other week as we engage the culture without the culture war. I'm your host, Philip Marinello, saying Halloween is over and we're already talking about Christmas. This is not just a holiday-themed podcast, but we really do love the series from IVP, thinking church calendar, and at the end of the year, it's kind of hard to get away from. We considered doing an episode on Thanksgiving and the merits of, and kind of like, do we want to actually be promoting this? But as we're getting these new books from IVP, we don't want to just put our Christmas episode out like mid-December when we're already well into the season. This is some wonderful stuff that we think is really great to be prepared ahead of time. So that's what we got up for you here today. If you're new to The Substance, we're a Christian variety show where every other week we invite somebody who is smart or interesting or doing good work in a field that we appreciate, and we have them talk about what they are doing. Previous guests include folks like Karen Swallow Pryor, Courtney Ellis, Miles Wernz, Caitlin Chess, and Propaganda. We've got a nice little library. If you're new to the show, you can go check those episodes out. So today we have Emily Hunter McGowin on to talk about her new book from IVP, the Fullness of Time series on Christmas. Longtime listeners may recognize the series. We had senior editor and author himself, Isa McCulley. His book on Lent was kind of the one that launched the series. Then we had Emilio Alvarez on to talk about Pentecost. And now we've got book. This series has been such a treasure. So Emily, Dr. McGowin, she had me call her Emily, which I did appreciate. Emily is an associate professor of theology over at Wheaton College. She's also a priest and a canon theologian at the Anglican diocese of Churches for the Sake of Others. She's also an author. This is not her first book. She's got a number of books out already. After this conversation, I'm interested in checking some of her other stuff out. So yeah, this was a wonderful conversation. Like I said, it already feels like Christmas time is upon us. This book is a wonderful resource to kind of focus our minds and hearts as the season goes. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Emily on Christmas. Emily, welcome to The Substance.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
I'm really glad this worked out. And right away, I really appreciated it in our pre-recording. So just call me Emily. So whenever we have folks on, especially that I haven't interacted with loads and loads, I'm like, just go with it. I check, okay, PhD, we'll go with the doctor. You're like, no. I said, okay, perfect.
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
So Emily, this is now our third episode for the IVP's Fullness of Time series. We love these books. I know a lot of folks who listen have purchased these and love these. And I especially like, because yours is on Christmas, the little like shiny gold wrapping on the inside. It looks like a present.
Yeah.
These are just lovely is a great word. These are beautiful little editions that I'm very excited. Every time I get a new one from IVP, I'm like, oh, this looks so good on my shelf. I can't wait to, and they're really accessible to like the lay person. I love the goal of it. Like when we had Isa on, I thought his heart for the series was exactly what we need, especially for folks who are, a lot of people in my and our generation are reconsidering things and very interested in like, how has the church been doing things for centuries and centuries? And this series is a great kind of open door to that.
I'm glad. Yeah, I was really excited to be a part of the series.
So, Emily, for folks who may not be overly familiar with you, you've got a few books out. Kind of briefly, what's your kind of faith biography? Where do you come from? Where did you get to where you are? We'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so I actually wasn't raised in a Christian home. I came to faith as a teenager in a Southern Baptist church in Texas, and almost immediately fell in love with theology. And didn't know what that meant for my life, but went on to study biblical studies as an undergrad and then seminary. Again, not really sure where I was going. I just wanted to keep studying and went on to do a PhD in theology at the University of Dayton. By that point, I had realized I was going to teach. But my relationship with God has always been in, conversation with theological things and biblical studies. And so my intellectual life and my spiritual life have always been wedded. But That said, I don't want to give the impression that my writing and teaching ministry is impractical or just abstract pie in the sky stuff. I actually, my training is in what we might call lived theology. So studying how theology is embodied in real people and real communities. And I think that that's part of what made it natural for me to write this book, because it's like, how do we live the Feast of the Incarnation? What does that mean? We have these theological ideas. What does it look like in practice? So a lot of my writing has that same theme. It's not all the same stuff, but I hope there's always this push to let the rubber meet the road, so to speak, and be practical.
Well, that is something that we value a ton here. We always joke, like, we have little playlists where, like, okay, like, because we have a variety of different topics and things we cover from different views, like nearly 100% of the theological topics we cover, we joke, could all be in the like either embodiment or like theology of place. Like this is exactly probably the center of our theological concern here at the show. So I was very excited to see when I did a little bit of digging. I was like, oh, this is perfect, like perfect guest for this show, and would love to, excited to talk to you about Christmas and your work. But I feel like we could talk about a number of different things, and it would be of great value.
I should have added, I didn't mention that in that journey I described, my husband and I both transitioned out of the Southern Baptist world into the Anglican world. And with that shift came a shift in imagination about the role of creation, and then in particular sacraments. And so that's kind of important for folks to know about me and my work as well. So certainly trained in predominantly evangelical spaces, but I did my PhD with Catholics, and then found myself in the Anglican tradition. So I think I've learned a lot from a variety of traditions within the global church.
Don't want to make this all biographical, but since just for my edification, I'm very curious. So you talked about being raised, growing up spiritually in the Southern Baptist world. Your husband was a pastor there, correct?
He was, yeah. When we were married, he was serving as a youth pastor in an SBC church. We both graduated from an SBC undergrad institution and assumed we would continue to serve in that environment. But our theology began to shift. Our views on women in ministry began to shift. And eventually it became clear that we weren't going to be able to stay in the Southern Baptist world with integrity, at least, anymore.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, no, I just think that that's a very exciting and interesting transition. Like, you married a pastor in the Southern Baptist, and now you're both in the Anglican world, and you're a priest married to a priest. You're a priest couple now.
That's right. We never would have predicted that. When we were married 20 years ago, I mean, I was planning to be a professor, but I was going to be a Southern Baptist pastor's wife and professor. He was the pastor, I was the professor. And then over the course of the next 10, 15 years, things substantively changed. And we both came to some realizations about my calling that forced us to change. Yeah.
I think that's very helpful for folks who maybe came up in a more rigid system, who feel like maybe, well, my convictions are changing. I'm learning things. I'm growing, and I don't feel completely home in this system. And some of those systems were so strong on, this is true, this is the only truth, and if you're outside of this, you're in trouble, that there are other ways.
It's true. Thanks be to God. I mean, the important thing is to know that none of the bodies on earth right now are perfect. That's not an excuse for justifying or overlooking, abuses or injustice, but none of the bodies are perfect. But you can, in fact, be Christian in other ways. And I think that's hopeful for people who are perhaps going through some kind of deconstruction or other transition.
No, that's something that has personally in my own family given me a lot of solace. And I know a lot of our listeners as well responded to. When we had Dr. McCauley on, Esau said something to the effect of, there's great value in being in fellowship with a body where you don't constantly have to like
defend yourself and give an answer where you are. And again, not that we're not trying to have a high standard, not that we're trying to not pursue holiness and truth and things like that, but to not be having to constantly feeling like you are not secure in where you are.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Esau on that.
So, and you guys are both in the Anglican. We have a number of listeners who have made the transition over to regularly fellowshipping with Anglican bodies, and I flirted with it. I don't come from a very liturgical tradition. I've really enjoyed these books, but last year in Kansas City, there's one of the large Anglican churches. I went to several of their Lenten services. I enjoyed that a lot. Been reading the NRSV for a while since we had him on, so maybe, who knows? We'll see what happens. But it's exciting to kind of be exposed to those great things. So before we do get to Christmas, I am very curious. Your first book on families, how did that come about?
Yeah, so that book is based on my doctoral dissertation. And like many doctoral dissertations, it happened through an accumulation of seminar papers that after the second or third, my advisor was like, so you're writing a dissertation on this, I see.
You've already sunk the time and effort. Why not? You're like halfway done.
Right. Yeah. So there were two interests of mine, and I, all scholarship is autobiographical, so I won't pretend otherwise. I was a new mom and a PhD student. I had a 4-month-old when I started the program. We went on and had 2 more, our glorious surprises over the next few years. And so I was very much struggling with, can I be a mom and a scholar? Can I be a mom and a theologian? What does this even look like? I'd never seen it done before. And so I encountered these stories of very committed and passionate evangelical women who'd given their lives to having as many children as God would give them, homeschooling them, which is very intensive as a way of life, and were really committed to patriarchy as a structure for their family. And I just sort of had this curiosity, like, are they, just for me personally, are they happier? Are they more content? Do they have less stress in their life because they're not having to wonder what they're committed to every day? And so that point of curiosity then got combined with my interest in using ethnographic research methods, which are normally in the field of anthropology, but to use that to study people of faith and to take seriously their practice, their way of life, as a place of theological reflection. So I took my curiosity and I took ethnographic research methods and got trained in that, and spent 2.5 years doing in-depth interviews with these mainly mothers of what were then called quiverful families, and just tried to learn as much as I could about how they lived and saw themselves and their work as mothers and their children and their families. And then wrote a dissertation on it that turned into a book.
And I've gotten in trouble for this before, but what surprised you? Any kind of like nuggets and teasers of like things that either you're like, okay, no, this was what I expected, or, oh, wow, like this really kind of is a surprising finding?
So I'll say the thing that wasn't really surprising to me, but I think it would be surprising to readers, especially if you're not familiar with quiverful and you've just heard about it. There's an impression, of course, based on the rhetoric, that it's a very patriarchal movement, and it is in terms of rhetoric and theology. But in practice, these households, at least the ones that I researched, are very mother-centered. The mothers, by virtue of their very full lives, educating all these children, are the administrators of the home. They often have they're really gifted actually in administration and management. And I think folks have the impression that it's a very patriarchal feeling home, if that's such a thing. But that's not, in fact, what I encountered. These moms had considerable leadership and freedom and cultural power, at least within their domestic space, and often used that to correct their husbands, to ask them to do more work, because they had this shared goal in having a large family and educating them in the home. And so I think that would be unexpected for most people. It didn't really surprise me, but it might.
Because functionally, right, you think like, a functional full-on patriarchy is kind of hard to actually execute.
Well, particularly if you're going to have lots of children.
Yeah.
Because in practice, in our society, and this is something I get to toward the end of the book, in the United States, if you are trying to live in a like single family home with only one person working to support the family, and you're doing all this within,
and you have loads and loads of kids, that's
lots of kids and very few hands to help. And so in terms of the amount of work that it creates in the home, you end up with often an egalitarian looking marriage in terms of practice, because so much has to be done. Someone's got to do it. Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, so that's interesting. I've not, like the quiverful movement as like proper, I've only brushed up against, but I know a lot of people who have kind of functionally kind of live that out. Like they wouldn't necessarily identify that way, but I mean, I know people very close to my family that have like upwards of a dozen kids. And that's just kind of like, that's a very strong commitment to a particular like lifestyle and way of life.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a thoroughgoing commitment to what they think Jesus calls them to do. And I think one of the things that was important to me in the book is to take that seriously and not denigrate it or just dismiss this kind of religious practice as fanaticism or something. So yeah, I try to treat it as charitably as possible.
I like that. That's usually you think of dissertation topics as kind of dry. That's a very interesting one.
Well, I knew if I was going to write about it for, 6 years or so, it would have to be very interesting.
So Christmas, you write towards the beginning that Christmas, even when you were raised in an irreligious home, that Christmas was always a special time. You could always sense the magic. What was the place of Christmas kind of in your heart and life as a young woman?
Yeah. So my family of origin was actually very unstable and unsafe. I had an alcoholic father, and I was never able to really relax at home. He was unpredictable in his behavior. But it seemed like the holidays, oddly enough, this is not the case for everyone, but oddly enough, the holidays provided some sort of respite. And my mom especially loved decorating and making everything special. She was a working mom, so she didn't always have a ton of time, but it was, for whatever reason, really important to her. And so that time of year stood out to me in my experience as it just had a lot of warm memories. There were times of feeling safe, loved, surrounded by family. It didn't feel quite so anxiety-inducing as my regular life was.
Well, and it's hard not to, I mean, like you absolutely talk about in the book, the commercialization and all of that. It's still hard to not get swept up a little, especially when you're young. It is like an undeniably magical time.
Yes.
It's very special.
Yeah. And I just don't think there's any working against that. I don't think there's any way to get away from it. And so that's why one of my aims with the book is to perhaps help us reframe, to provide additional meaning, to give us resources, through which to I can't think of anything else other than beef up what already exists, what we already experience. I think that it's supposed to be magical, even if we think it has a lot to do with, say, the Coca-Cola Santa Claus and gifts under the tree. Maybe so, but I think also we really do believe as Christians that God became flesh in the incarnation. I mean, you can't get much more like magical than that.
I loved your dedication as well for your mother-in-law. Tell me about, and you talk about that in the book as well, not just in the dedication, about how as when you and your husband got together to begin your family, how the specialness of Christmas was a very important part of that as well.
Yes. My mother-in-law, Susan, was a Christmas fanatic, and she just had such childlike joy about all of it. And I tell a story in the book about so much so that our first Christmas Eve night spent with her, she woke us up at like 4:30 in the morning to open gifts. And I remember like waking up, I can still kind of see the carpet in my head from the air mattress we were laying on and thinking, what the heck is wrong with this woman that she's waking us up so early? And yeah, we only had a couple Christmases with her before she passed away from pancreatic cancer. And I can't help, I think of her all the time, but especially around Christmas. She never got to meet her grandchildren. And I know how much she would have delighted in getting to celebrate with them. So yeah, there was nobody else I was going to dedicate the book to than her.
No, I love that. Yeah. Christmas with family is special. Now I've got two little ones. I still love Christmas, but it's a very special thing to share that with a young child who like they can't I can't not see the magic, but for them it's just so apparent. It's such a delight.
For sure.
You talk about a number of things. There's four main focuses you have as far as God's role in Christmas, and the most like clear one, the foundational one is the incarnation, the God of the great exchange. And you highlight something that I wasn't terribly familiar with, the antiphon.
Yeah.
Is that a liturgical?
It is. So it's something that's sung. There are lots of antiphons in the church tradition. The one that I highlight there, I just think is particularly beautiful. So when I started writing about the incarnation, I thought I'll just use that as a focal point.
So, I mean, the role of the incarnation, like we know, like Christmas is when we celebrate like God coming into the world, but why is that? Like, what can we by dwelling on it seriously in the season? How can that both enhance our experience of it, but also talked about like the lived in nature, like living this among our neighbors of faith and our neighbors not of faith? Like, why is that important?
So I think it's especially important if we can, this is the big if we can call it to mind throughout our day and throughout the weeks. And I think that's actually the sticking point for most of us. We know these theological truths about ourselves, about God, about the world, but we just forget them. we forget them, 10 minutes after we've been reminded of them. But if we can actually hold on to the idea that the Word became flesh in Jesus Christ, that he has for all time joined God to creation, and that God is working to make all things new, then that really can transform the most mundane things that we do in our day, as well as the most meaningful things. Interaction with neighbors, giving your kid a bath before bed, cheering for a friend at their softball game. Like, all of it is within this narrative in which the triune God has demonstrated that he's making all things new, and we're getting to experience little bits and pieces of that now in anticipation of the kingdom coming in the future. As I said, the challenge is to hold on to that, to truly let that color and inform everything that we're doing.
Well, and one of the smaller themes, I guess, in the history of our show has really been that of unity. And I liked how you highlighted how unity really is the central theme of the Christmas season. Like, God sent, like, the incarnation was God uniting with man in a new way that hadn't happened before in like linear time, in order to eternally reunite man with God to a full relationship. And that can easily get lost. Like, that really takes effort and energy, where we can maybe pass that on like a theology, like true or false test.
Right.
But that is something, especially in the commercialization, that can get lost. Right.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's not just the commercialization. We're also living, after the Enlightenment in, what historians would just call modernity, where it can feel as though the world around us is just evacuated of God's presence. And so in our imagination, even if we've been raised in church, we can imagine that God is somehow absent. God is only located in like special places like church or, when I'm praying or in Bible study, but we don't think God is present and active and at work everywhere else. And I think that setting in modernity where God is absent, combined with the commercialization of Christmas, can make it feel really empty and saccharine and sad, which is part of what I was trying to combat with the book.
Well, and I mean, you read stories and stats every year, like depression and suicide always spikes during the holiday time because people that is more highlighted. People who are on the fringes, and we'll talk about that in a minute, like the people who are like the least of these and the poor in spirit and the poor, like the lower rungs of folks, like they can feel that more when it's like this is the good time, like where we're all celebrating our excess and we're giving extravagant gifts and things like that. We're celebrating grandly. And if you're not in, like a lot of the people who are doing that are maybe not doing it fully and with fully engaged, but then the people who can be outside of that can also be the temptation of, oh man, like I am lesser than, or I'm missing out.
That's right. Yeah. And we can't ignore, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the like actual seasonal changes. It's just darker more often and it's cold. And that it does make a difference. Like we are embodied creatures, and the darkness and the cold, again, for those of us in the part of the world where that overlaps with Christmas, it really has an effect on you. And if you're also isolated and alone, unfulfilled in your job, struggling to make ends meet, you can see how that leads to despair.
Well, and just I was having this conversation with somebody last week. So, I mean, in Kansas City here, it just started. You're in the Midwest as well, right?
Yeah, we're Chicagoland.
Chicago. I can't wait to get back to Chicago. We just had two of our last 3 or 4 guests have been from Chicago. And I was like, I can't wait to get back out there. But I mean, sun's down at 5 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And if you are sucked into, and I have a great job with a lot of flexibility, and I don't have a soul crushing 9 to 5, but even so, like the way we do work, if you're gone from your family all day long, mm-hmm. maybe doing something you don't love to kind of just get by and you don't feel like you're thriving, and your whole day is gone and the sun is down by the time you get home. It is colder. You're getting less. If you're able to go outside, you're getting less sun. Mm-hmm. And by the time you have any semblance of freedom, there is no sun. It can be a grim time.
It absolutely is. And I think that this is the part where people can feel, including myself, the most dissonance with the like happy, clappy, joyful Christmas time is here stuff. And I worry that when the church then, or churches, I guess I should say, also give the impression that it should only be happy, clappy, isn't life grand, that we're missing people where they really are. And by missing people where they really are, we're also missing where God is wanting to meet those people. We're missing the opportunity to say, no, God is with you in the darkness, in the sadness, in the despair. You're not alone. I don't want to miss out on that.
So when you talk about the God of the poor, what would you say for, and I mean, again, this is broad, but for various traditions, if we're speaking to people in an American context, which is the vast majority of the audience and most of our climates is that. So what does knowing truly the God of the poor during Christmas time, how would that affect our practice, mm-hmm. both religiously and engaging in holiday stuff?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me like, and this, again, I'm saying this not as someone who has worked this out and feels like I've perfected this, but it seems to me that it would change who you spend your time with. And some of us already do this. We have a tradition already of perhaps spending more time with, I don't know, say charities or shelters or whatever. But if God really has chosen to be in solidarity with humanity through, this Miriam of Nazareth, this peasant woman on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, then it makes sense to seek God also and those who are like her within our society, those who are like Jesus, the colonized Jewish peasant. And so it might change the way we conduct our holiday activities when we do have spare time, rather than maybe having a glitzy party. As much as I love parties, instead of having a glitzy party where we spend a bunch of money, with just those who we already have good relationship with, what if we got to know other families down the block, or people who are seriously lacking their material needs during the holidays? It seems like we should expect to meet God there. And the church tradition has told us through the centuries that we absolutely will. So that's one practical thing that I think it can change about how we celebrate and observe Christmas.
Was that a part of your routine when you were in the Southern Baptist world, or did that for you? What was like your first real Christmas with a servant kind of mindset? What was that like for you?
Honestly, I think that probably didn't happen until shortly after I was married. And getting married didn't have anything to do with it. It just so happened that we were reading and thinking about this with other people and in new ways. And I remember being exposed to the story or the life of Dorothy Day, and how she would encourage people to, in their homes, always have what she called a Christ room, a room that could offer hospitality to those in need. And my husband and I, when we were first married, were able to, this was in rural Texas, property was quite cheap. We were able
the days.
Right. Not anymore. But we were able to purchase a home that had 2 extra bedrooms. And I remember coming up toward, it was really Thanksgiving, but coming up to that time of year and thinking, it is ridiculous that we have 2 rooms in our house that are literally sitting empty. And so we started asking, are there people that we are meant to have join with us and have as part of our household, either, permanently or for a temporary period of time? And that began a tradition for our family of having people stay with us. It just so happened that coincided with the holidays. And I think that's probably why I immediately thought of that. But we've always had single people at various times of life stay with us, some as short as, 6 months, sometimes a couple years, often transitioning between, a time of instability into a more clear path. And I don't know, that really shaped how I think about my stuff. And
a couple of years. Like, I was surprised when you said as little as several months, and it's like, oh man, like,
yeah,
because we think of, let's give somebody a meal, right? Like, let's give somebody a shower and some clothes.
Sure. And there's room
but
for
to
that.
truly take no. And I'm not saying that, like, this is some sort of ideal, but like, I imagine the act of taking somebody truly into your home, not just stay for a week while you're in transition, but to truly like bring someone into your family for like a couple months. Like that's time to not necessarily assimilate, but to, like, your patterns will overlap. Like you are in relationship with somebody in a way that, I mean, when I was younger, I crashed on people's couches here and there and lived in extra rooms briefly, but like, that's not like living with the family and taking meals together and spending your evenings together. Like that's a whole new level.
It is. And one of the things it did for us as newly married people is it really forced us to live with integrity.
Yeah.
We have people watching us, not in a like bad way, but just
sure.
We were around people. They knew that he was a pastor, and we were like professional holy people, so to speak. And so there was no possibility of bifurcating our life into, church life and home life, or church life and personal life. It was very formational for us.
And I would say on this topic, one other thing that you did mention in the book, and I appreciate, like, at a certain point, I was like, well, what about how can we, or what would be your encouragement rather? Like, you don't need to have like, here's your script, but what would be a good way to think about in the West, while it is simultaneously true that because a lot of the systems we live in, like people are living through hardships and hard times, but we also do have a lot simultaneously. So how can we truly, actually, genuinely encourage prosperous people to maybe think about these things without being obnoxious or self-righteous about it? Because a lot of us have probably gone through that. I probably maybe more than others in ways. Like when you come to various points of enlightenment, or you see things, you're like, oh, like I really need to tell everybody about this, especially the ones who like are like really not, or to me are really not living this out. So how can we encourage our churches and the people in our communities positively towards this without going overboard?
Yeah. This is hard. I'm not sure I have the answer to this, because this has to be worked out in context, doesn't it? Like it depends on your particular, calling in your community, the people that you have there, your experiences, and the rapport or lack thereof that you have with them. I think one of the factors would be just renewing our familiarity with what Jesus himself says about our stuff and about wealth, particularly he calls mammon, and it's pictured as in competition with God's kingdom. And I think you can teach, preach, however you want to talk about that, meditate on that and receive that as a challenge. And then also the way Paul talks about wealth in the New Testament epistles. You can see the example in the book of Acts for how the people of God are known to live. And then I think to avoid it being overwhelming for individuals, it helps to start, I think, in terms of a group. What could we as a community commit to? Because I think the hard part is we sort of imagine, all right, well, I have to restructure my budget, or I have to do X, Y, or Z. And certainly there might be individual callings there, but I don't know. I feel like we can be more courageous and more creative as we work together and we say, okay, how might we improvise by the Holy Spirit's guidance, faithfulness to this gospel calling within our current environment and with our current limitations? Because not everyone can do everything.
That's true.
If you've got little kids, you have limitations in terms of your bandwidth that others don't have.
My goodness. I feel bad. Like I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we try to stay active, but I always do feel bad sometimes when they're like, oh, can you make it to this thing? And I'm just like, can we? I don't know.
That's a real thing. And to pretend otherwise is just not fair to people. And so we're all at different phases. We all have different challenges. We all have different, let's be clear, like wounds that need healing.
Yeah.
So this is why I don't think we need a one size fits all sort of admonition for how to obey, how to respond to the gospel's call in this area. But I do think it should be part of our discernment as communities, whether we're talking about small groups or churches. And Christmas is a good time to take that up again.
And I love the talking about like doing that together, because we are a very individualized culture, and a lot of times our faith practices and our faith communities can very much lean more individualistic, which obviously, like, yes, like we're made in the image of God, like we have value as individuals, but I mean, we lose a lot when we don't think corporately.
Sure. Well, and just the one thing that I'll add is, it seems to me that the only way that any sort of regular practice of dispossession, so giving up your stuff, the only way that a regular practice of that is going to make sense and be actually livable for real people today is if we have a community that we trust is going to care for our needs if and when they come up. Right? Like if we don't have a community that we trust is going to provide for our material needs if we find we are without, we're not going to give. And so it creates this cycle, right? This cycle of hoarding.
Yeah, like you don't want to be selfish, but if we're like, well, if I'm generous and I actually do get hard up, like, can I really go to anybody? Like, who's going to have my back?
Exactly. And so it actually requires God's people to be that community to each other, so that generosity becomes a way of life rather than a one-off that happens, once or twice a year.
You talk about creation and redemption and like little creations, and I thought it was very interesting that you tied the theme of that into decorations for Christmas. When did that come to you, and kind of how did you initially kind of break that down? Like how did that come?
So the thought about decoration being linked to creation and recreation, or creation and redemption, actually came from a book that I stumbled across through, I think it may have been a tweet back when Twitter was called Twitter.
Back when Twitter was good.
The good old days. From Fleming Rutledge. And she said something about this book called Approaching Christmas by a woman named Jane Williams. And she has a chapter in here about decorations that just blew my mind. She connected decorations to, I cite her in the book, the decorations of the temple. And that just got my mind going. And I thought, oh my gosh, why do we do this again? Is it just to sell things? I mean, for some, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But is there something deeper perhaps going on here? And that's what made the connection to, well, we're really making these things sacred. We're saying these things are meaningful, that they are worthwhile. And for Christians, that they are going to be redeemed. Not redeemed fully yet, but one day they will be. And that just for me at least, put Christmas decorations in a whole new light.
I really love that. Any thoughts on how do you and your husband like disciple your children in that with your, I don't know how, like in your home, in your church, I don't know what your responsibilities are as far as church decorations, but as you decorate your home and whatever the responsibility level is decorating the church, how does that go together? Like purposefully, like using that as not like a ham-fisted teaching opportunity, but like the whole Deuteronomy, like at all times, like how are you and how ought we to think about potentially as the season, because this is going to get published before Christmas time starts proper, because I wanted to kind of get this out there early. Like how can we be thinking about purposefully discipling our young ones and encouraging the saints around us?
Right. So I got to be honest with you, this connection I only made writing the book, and my kids are now 14, 13, and 10.
Yeah, you have I saw some of your Halloween pictures. I was like, she's got kids, but not like baby kids.
So I think I actually sort of missed the window to inculcate this. I mean, I've said something about it now as we're preparing, because they're already asking, when are we going to get out the decorations? And so I've said a few things about it. But once they get to this age, adolescent teenagers, they can really sniff out sermons, sermons. So I have to, play it cool. I imagine when it's time to decorate, we'll probably talk a little bit about it. As far as our home is concerned, we've actually never framed it in this way. And I'm excited about other people being able to benefit from that idea. For church, our little church, we have a little little church plant here. We haven't done Christmas decorations before, but I have been part of churches that have a whole liturgical ceremony for greening the church, where they intentionally liturgically place decorations in the worship space, and they combine that with readings of scripture and prayer to kind of give those things that we just think of as fun visual effects, the theological meaning that they deserve. And so I think that could be something practical that churches can do, rather than having a committee come in on Saturday morning and put it up in secret. Make it something the whole church does together, and to provide some guidance as to why and what it means and what it's for.
Because, I've thought a lot about in the last few years with our young boys, I want to have traditions that mean something. And
Mhm.
I think that is a really cool. And I mean, religiously, I really enjoyed last year going to the local Anglican church for Lent. I'll probably pop in and just kind of pop back in St. Aidan's here in Kansas City and just kind of see how some of these services go. Like I really do think that there is a lot of value to the liturgy. What you just said, like tying the things we do to their meaning, because a
Mhm.
lot of times those two, like you said, why do we put up a tree? Like putting up like a nativity set, like that can just be like, oh, like this is like a visual teaching aid. But I mean, it doesn't have to just be that. Like
Right.
it can be a lot more than that. And that's very exciting for me. So liturgically speaking, for those of us who are maybe not, who haven't experienced liturgical Christmas services, how do they go? Like, what do you get most excited for in the liturgical Christmas
Mhm.
services?
Well, so in our tradition, there is the possibility of doing Christmas Eve and Christmas Day services. A lot of churches don't have the resources to do both, which I understand. But I actually love the combination of the two, even though as a pastor's family, it requires more work of us. But the gathering on Christmas Eve, I mean, there's just no beating the like aesthetic of all the lit candles while we sing a closing hymn, and acknowledge the coming of the light of God in Christ. That is probably my favorite moment, even if I have memories of almost burning myself or a child experience. Um, but then Christmas Day is always very, I shouldn't say very, it's often sparsely attended because it's Christmas
Sure.
Day. And I get that, no judgment. But I sort of love the simplicity of it because it's sparsely attended. The homily or the sermon is often very short. Last year, my husband actually read a homily from St. John Chrysostom so as not to have to prepare another sermon. And then, we sing a few Christmas songs and say some prayers and we go home. And I actually love the simplicity of that. We didn't have musicians last year. It just reminds you that, like, you can worship just by gathering the people of God, attending to scripture, attending to prayer. If you do Eucharist, celebrating in that way. But it doesn't have to be all the smells and bells. And at Christmas, you can feel this pressure to do that. Christmas Eve services, I think, especially have that pressure. But a simple Christmas Day service, I think, for me at least, over the past several years, has been the most, I hate the word impactful, but that's the one that's coming to mind. But it's had the most, or left the heaviest impression that God does in fact come to us in the mundane, in the normal, and not in the flash and the smoke, and this, smells and bells.
I really, again, appreciated, was pleasantly surprised when you talk about how Christmas is the time of like life and light. And as a part of the Christmas story, anybody who has any proximity to it knows about like Herod's massacre of the children. You tied that to a lot of our modern day, like the gun violence crisis. Like, and as a church, we've had a few guests recently. Caitlin Chess, I think, was the most recent one, talking about churches trying to positively get engaged politically.
Mhm.
And Christmas really is not a time where I think about politics, but looking at all of these things together holistically, how can we think about justice in that arena in the Christmas season?
Well, I feel like you've already sort of pointed us in the right direction. I think that the recognition that Jesus, as soon as God appears in the flesh, the darkness rises up and tries to snuff him out. I think that forces us to pay attention to the ways in which the powers and principalities in our world are trying to spread death and darkness. And so that can be in many arenas. Obviously, again, I think this is contextual. But, I think about the communities just over the past year that have experienced the kinds of mass shootings that I reference in the book. It seems like Christmas would be a natural time in which to acknowledge that those of us who are in Christ and who have submitted to his lordship, even from the cradle, right, even as a toddler fleeing Herod, would then be asked to take up a place of solidarity with those who find themselves similarly threatened by violence and by darkness and death. And again, that can take many forms, but it seems like we are a people of life and light, and therefore there should be some sort of embodied resistance to the things that work against that. And one way that could be is certainly trying to move the needle in terms of gun violence prevention. But there may be other ways too, depending on your particular community.
Well, and I love that so much because in a deeply, sadly, heartbreaking, frustrating way, a lot of times in a broad brush, a lot of the things you see, like the politically engaged church folks or some of the loudest folks, are not the ones advocating for and identifying with victims. So I was very encouraged by that, and I'm hoping to be a part of that and see that more. And also, like, there is that going on as well. Right. So to be encouraged that sometimes the loud, brash folks who are maybe not living in the most Christ-like way are the ones getting the most bandwidth and clicks and like rage and upset. And like me being upset by something, like that drives traffic and the algorithm knows that. So sometimes those are the things being put out, but an encouragement to both be that in my community, embodied like where I am physically, but also to know that others are doing that as well, and to be in solidarity and to lift them up and to rejoice that, because I mean, that's being salt and light, right? Like we want to say, hey, like we have good news. Like we want to be, like we want to have something to offer the world. And that's, I feel like what could be a better testimony in that arena? Like that's where you would think like that's where the church should be engaged.
Absolutely. Yes.
Anything else in particular to whether you're liturgical or non-liturgical, what would you recommend if somebody's like, I want to be more focused, other than, hey, check out the book. We'll plug the book. It's nice that the book is already out and available. Do you have an audiobook? Did that come out yet?
I got to record the audiobook myself.
How's that?
It was so fun. I've never done it before. I was so glad they let me do it. So yes, there is a recording. You can get it, I guess, on like Audible or other places where they sell audiobooks.
I can't wait for that to come to Hoopla. I'm very excited. I've loved the whole, again, these are great little, nice little, what's this, about 115 pages, 120 pages? Yeah. Like these are very digestible. I think that especially since it's out now, I think this would be a great little study. Get together some small groups, some people. I look for, have you gotten any, or other than, so I mean, we talked about this also before the air. Friend of the show, Courtney Ellis, I was talking to her yesterday about this. She's very excited for the book. Have you gotten any from pastors or churches that have already kind of started to engage? Have you gotten any feedback yet personally?
Not from pastors or churches that are doing it as a group. I've gotten individual feedback, which has been really encouraging. I think my favorite so far is actually a friend of mine and a colleague here at Wheaton, Tim Larson, who literally edited like this giant book on Christmas and who wrote a lovely endorsement. And so it meant a lot coming from him that he thought I had done well with the history and theology. But I agree with you. I think that the days between Christmas Day and those 12 days of Christmas can be easy to lose in the fog of visiting family and, gifts and shopping or whatever, returning gifts maybe. But I think that maybe starting the book before then and then finishing it up during that time could be a useful way to just remember what it's all about and not get lost in the midst. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this book. I'm excited that we have it. I hope to probably give it to some people here this season and just kind of hear, listeners, if you get the book, tweet or whatever. I don't know if Twitter's still going to be around in a month or two. By the time Christmas is here, send her an email or a DM. Let her know how much you appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you.
So Emily, we talked about this substance shout-outs. What have you been reading? What have you been watching? What have you been listening to? What have you been enjoying as culture, art, resource? And you can give me a couple if there are a couple things that you've really loved lately. What would you commend to the audience that has enriched your life lately?
So lately, it's really been like about 6 months or so. I have been reading the work of C. Rene Padilla, who is a Latin American evangelical theologian. And I wish I had been introduced to his work earlier. He's written some beautiful stuff on the gospel and the kingdom of God, and it has revitalized my interest in that aspect of theology, and it's also already begun to inform my teaching. I think it's really practical too. So even people who are not professional theologians or pastors would benefit a lot. He's got a book called Mission Between the Times that has been especially helpful to me. So I'd certainly recommend him. I've also been working on a review of my colleague Amy Peeler's book, Women and the Gender of God.
I've seen that on my feed lately. I'm excited to check that out sometime.
Well, and what the overlap that I have with it is that she spends a lot of time in the Annunciation narrative in Luke. So thinking about Christmas themes, Mary and Jesus feature prominently in the book, and it's really fantastic, very lucidly written. So yeah, it is academic, but she writes so clearly that it's very accessible for regular people. More like in the fun side of things. I don't laugh at me, but I have never watched before the 1995 or 96 Pride and Prejudice from BBC.
Oh, nice.
And I know that's very late to the game, but I'd never seen it before. And I had, it was over our little fall break. We had like a 3-day fall break. And it's
long.
It is long, 6 one-hour episodes, but it was delightful. It was just delightful. I enjoyed that so much. In a world of so much darkness and cynicism, it was just really fun to enjoy a witty, rather innocent story. Certainly it has its limits culturally, but I really enjoyed that.
Are there any movies or books in the McGowin household that get returned to during Christmas time? Do you guys have any of those you always read or you always watch together that you always look forward to?
Yeah, we actually have bins. This is one of our traditions. We have bins, nice. One of books and one of movies. And we have a few Christmas playlists that only come out during Christmastide. Nice. And it makes it really special because you don't get them many other times. And we all, even now with the teenagers, we just kind of mob those bins when they come out. And so it's some of the standards. Of course, there's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. But we've also gotten some really beautifully illustrated stories of the Nativity. I'm trying to think. We have one that we read on the Feast of St. Nicholas, which I know isn't properly in the Christmas season yet, but it's St. Nicholas and I think it's the 9 coins or the 7 coins.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's really great.
I'm familiar with that. I think I read it once. It's not like a regular of mine, but I enjoyed that.
Yeah. And then movies, I'm really the one who loves the Christmas movies. So my kids and my husband
humor you.
They humor me. The one that I have grown to appreciate, I did not like as a child, but I have learned to love, is It's a Wonderful Life.
Nice.
And now I make them watch it with me at least once over the Christmas break. My girls have always loved White Christmas, which I don't fully understand, but I'll watch that with them. And what's the other one? Oh, of course, Will Ferrell and Elf.
I think we're finally going to show our boys that this year. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I mean,
it's fun.
It's so goofy and silly, but we need some of that sometimes. So
we do. Yeah. Well, Emily, thank you for your time. This has been great. I'm glad to get to meet you and know you. I really love this book. It's I'm so grateful for this whole series. Did you was this announced at the beginning, or was this one of the newer? Because Christmas, that had to have been on the initial
It
slate of the
was.
Fullness of Time.
Yeah. When Esau approached me and said, "Do you want to do Christmas?" I immediately said yes. I was like, I have been training for this since I was a child. Yes, please.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad to have it, and I can't wait to get it into more people's hands. So, Emily, I'll have a link to the book in the show notes here. Where can folks find you? What would be the best way for folks to connect with you and your work?
Yeah, so I do have a website, emilymcgowan.com. If you wanted to contact me about coming to speak at your church or retreat or whatever, you can use the contact form there. It goes to my personal email address. I'm also on the site formerly known as Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Is that it? Oh, and Threads. That's the only
nice
extra one.
Are you threading?
Yeah, trying.
Nice.
The habit for the site formerly known as Twitter is hard to break.
It is, and it stinks because it's like that was such a wonderful. That's actually how we connected. I was very grateful. Like whenever IVP announces a new thing, I feel like authors typically and professors are more on Twitter because it used to be more of a engaging of ideas kind of platform. Right. So that's usually where I'm like, hey, love to have you on the show if it made sense. And we've got a lot of great guests from Twitter, but it's a little bit more challenging right now. And we don't know if Threads or Blue Sky or any of these other things are going to actually work. So it's interesting times.
Very much so. Yeah.
Well, all right. I will put your links in the show notes there. And just once again, thank you for your time. Really enjoyed getting to talk with you. So that was my conversation with Dr. McGowin, with Emily. Had a really good time talking with her. I love this series from IVP, this Fullness of Time. It's been really encouraging to me, and appreciate all of you guys who have checked it out and shared your thoughts. I think this is a really great resource, especially for those of us who maybe didn't get a whole lot of exposure to the church calendar and various forms of liturgy growing up, just kind of being exposed to this is our some of the legacy of our faith. And I know some of us have tapped into various elements. So really love this conversation. If you like this and want to get more of the Fullness of Time, like I said, we previously have had on Esau McCulley for his book on Lent. We had Emilio Estevez on for Pentecost, and we weren't able to get on the schedule. I don't think Dr. Warren, Tish Harrison Warren, who did Advent, is really doing podcasts, but last year we did have Betty Dickinson, who also put a really great book out on Advent with IVP actually too. So we're keeping it in the IVP family. If you want to check that out, last late November or December, I think we actually did that one in December last year. We did Advent, so we're trying to get a little bit ahead of that this year. But yeah, if you want to check out Lent, Pentecost, and Advent, those are also in the library. So check those out and enjoy. If you want to get this book, a couple things. So we're going to have links in the show notes to purchase it. I believe IVP has some different sales going on right now. You'll find that information in the show notes if you want to purchase it from IVP. If you want to listen to Emily read her book in her own words, you can get it on Audible, various audio things. But if you have Hoopla, a lot of local libraries will have Hoopla as a free service. You can listen to it for free on Hoopla in her own words. And you can also listen to the Advent book. I am finishing up Emily's book right now, and then I've got Advent up next. They're about like 2.5 hours of listening. So those are fantastic in the show notes. But you guys can also be excited to look for on our social media in the week or so following the release of this episode. If you're listening early or when it drops, you can check our social media feed for a chance to win some copies. We're going to have some giveaways for Christmas as well. And maybe I wonder if we can do an Advent Christmas double. I'll reach out to the publisher and see if we can give away both. So there's that.
check out the socials for that. We're going to have links for Emily's work in the show notes as well. Follow her, encourage her. If you heard about her on the show and you check out her book or her various works, say, hey, really enjoyed your episode on The Substance. That really goes a long way to help us. Another great free way to help The Substance is just to share the show. We don't do topical things like Christmas in order to get shared, but if this material is encouraging or exciting to you and it helps you out, share it. Say, hey, just heard a great episode on Christmas from The Substance. Share it with your friends, family, on your various social medias. That always helps. And if you want to financially help, you can join our Patreon community where patrons can vote on future episodes and we'll get some exclusive content. Last episode we had was Sarah Welch Larson on the original Alien, and patrons can get access to an episode on her book that's on the entire Alien franchise. We're going to have future episodes coming as well. They're not going to be necessarily every other week like the main show, but whenever we're able to, whenever we have bonus material that doesn't necessarily make sense on the feed, the folks who are supporters of the show will have access to that as well. But if monthly support like a Patreon, like $3, $5, $10 a month, whatever, is not your bag, and you still appreciated the show and want to show us a little bit of love, you can do that on Cash App at $The Substance Pod. So there's that. If you want to get your voice on the show, maybe give us some feedback, tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like, have recommendations for guests or topics or books or films, things like that, you can email us a voice note at thesubstancepod@gmail.com if you want to get your voice on the show, giving us your feedback. That's always fun. So thesubstancepod@gmail.com, email us a voice note, preferably in the 90-second range. That would be great. And we'd love to hear from you. Really appreciate all you guys. Hope you guys have a wonderful holiday season coming up here. I've been your host, Philip Marinello, and we'll see you again next time on The Substance. And we'd love to hear from you. That was a long pause. I'll give you all that in one. We don't have a crazy budget, but we do try to be a polished show. So if there's anything,
if God really has chosen to be in solidarity with humanity through, this Miriam of Nazareth, this peasant woman on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, then it makes sense to seek God also and those who are like her within our society, those who are like Jesus, the colonized Jewish peasant. Don't laugh at me.